Hello, welcome to Inside Politics. I'm Anastasiya Lavrina. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Armenian Foreign Minister Ararat Mirzoyan launched the U.S.-Armenia Strategic Partnership Commission on January 14. Days earlier, the Armenian government finalized legislation authorizing efforts to qualify the country for European Union membership. For many years, Armenia had relied heavily on Russia for economic and strategic support. Traditionally, Armenia was considered firmly in Moscow's orbit as part of the Eurasian Economic Union and the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Moscow has responded to Armenia's action with a typical mix of irritation and indifference. On January 14, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov stated that Russia continues to view Armenia as a close partner, while criticizing the United States as a provocative force intent on creating unrest in the Caucasus. What's interesting is that in 2009, also in the beginning of January, Tbilisi and Washington signed a charter on strategic partnership described by the Georgian officials as historic. 16 years later, Georgia remains outside of NATO, and recent developments have indicated that EU membership is also not within reach in the near future. What consequences do these events have for the South Caucasus region? Will they impact the negotiation process between Baku and Yerevan toward a peace agreement? And perhaps most importantly, will they escalate tensions between Washington and Moscow? All details in my program right now. Joining me from the United States is Glenn Howard, founder and chairman of the Saratoga Foundation, former president of Jamestown Foundation. From Georgia, we have George Mchedlishvili, a political expert. And from Norway, with us is Glenn Diesen, professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. Dear experts, warm welcome to our program. Thank you so much for being with us today. So, Mr. Howard, let me start with you. Strategic Partnership Commission established by the USA and Armenia envision increased cooperation in the areas of economy, security and defense, democracy, and also people-to-people relations. How do you see the short and long-term perspectives of this document?
Well, first of all, it's a strategic partnership agreement. And so the United States signs a number of these agreements and sign them with countries periodically. And I think the main aspect of it is it's the Biden administration, they're outgoing, they're trying to have some type of last minute sign of cooperation with Armenia to show them the appreciation and reward the Armenian donors to the Democratic Party that are very wealthy, very powerful in California. And so this is a part of their aspects of they're trying to finish up this last gesture of good faith with Armenia. I think that it's really, if you look at the agreements the United States has signed like this before, they don't really mean very much at all. The United States has a past record of not coming through and backing agreements like this when countries need them. I mean, they have an agreement with Uzbekistan, and when was the last time you ever saw the United States having any interest in Uzbekistan? So I don't really put a lot of value in this. I think it's kind of characteristic of what the Biden administration is trying to do. It's a further reflection that in the region right now, the Pashinyan government is trying to bolster its domestic support. And this is a way of the United States kind of rewarding that. And there are things in the agreement that are important for Armenia. And don't get me wrong, such as the military aspect of it, cooperation. But really, I mean, the Armenian military is not a threat anymore, nothing like it was. So it's more kind of a gesture of sorts by the United States. And I'll stop there.
Indeed, very interesting. George, in 2009, as it was mentioned before, Tbilisi and Washington signed a charter on strategic partnership. How did that document change the policy of Georgia bilateral cooperation with the United States? And do you see any similarities with what we have today between Washington and Yerevan?
Okay, in the first place, good evening, Anastasiya. Thank you for the invitation. My greetings to my interlocutors and to your listeners, to the audience. Well, indeed, 16 years ago, then outgoing Bush administration signed a strategic partnership with Georgia. And we know, if we recall some history, 2 months later, there was a reset policy with the with Russia, which was, of course, for Georgia, it was like the writing in the wall. It was the indication that for all these lofty words of support, and agreement and serious backing, which is real and which benefited Georgia immensely, still there was an attempt to go business as usual with Russia. And we know that this is, I believe, on a more general term, if we zoom out a little bit, there is a tendency that the foreign policy, which used to be characterized by a very significant degree of continuity within the United States, is more fluctuating. It's becoming more volatile. Sometimes we see the so-called knee-jerk reaction of one president trying to undo the legacy of the previous one. So again, given the statements of Donald Trump and some members of his future administration, like before the inauguration, we might assume that Trump will not be particularly enamored of like Biden legacy. And again, it remains a question to what extent this agreement will be taken seriously by Trump. I think it is more like appreciation on the part of Biden administration of, quote, good behavior of Armenia, at least like rhetorically, and its attempt to get closer to the West. I think it was in a way a reward. Plus, as my previous speaker mentioned correctly, it will play to the advantage of Pashinyan's position within Armenia. Elections are coming in about a year. Obviously, there is a political rivalry. And in order to secure his victory, given that the positive attitude of the Armenian society towards the United States, and given actually kind of this like lobby interest, it could be very, very positive. Besides, of course, there are like very good phrases like where niceties about like democratic development, unleashing like human potential. I believe that in terms of economy, in terms of like technology, there is a ground for like optimism, and there are, of course, the spheres when the cooperation will benefit Armenia.
That's very interesting. It looks like a game of policymakers, both in Washington, when it comes to the Joseph Biden's administration, which is going to leave the White House quite soon, and also to the administration of Mr. Pashinyan, to his cabinet, which is having an election in a year, as it was mentioned. So, Mr. Dizon, what are the risks and the benefits for Armenia in aligning more closely with the United States in this strategic partnership?
Well, I guess the benefit is always to diversify more of your economic ties, your security partnerships in general. This was an objective for Armenia ever since it became independent, that is to have a multi-vector foreign policy. And it's reasonable to suggest they become excessively dependent on Russia over the years. That being said, the main risk is if you look at the motivations for the Europeans and the Americans, and that is what is the interest in Armenia, and it's mostly to try to sever it away from Russia. It's seen as a front line, something to isolate the Russians. Again, everything, at least over the past 20 years, is seen very much through the zero-sum lens of liberating the neighborhood as it was from Russian influence. But especially, of course, over the past 3 years, this has gone into overdrive. And if you just go through the articles or think tank papers or speeches by Western politicians, whenever they speak of Armenia, they can't talk about it without mentioning Russia. So again, everything is about creating dividing lines between the Russians and Armenians, which is why the Russians are seeing this as a massive disruption. And as the Russians have pointed out, if they also attempt to, for example, join the European Union, it will not be compatible with the Eurasian Economic Union, which goes back to this 2012 statement by Hillary Clinton when she argued that, they have to slow down or stop Eurasian integration. This is something America doesn't accept. So I think also, besides becoming a huge security problem, I think it's also an economic challenge. Keep in mind that are very dependent on Russia as an export market. Also, imports from Russia are very important, especially if you look in areas such as wheat. It's also the ability of the West to actually project force into that region is also more limited. So I think this is the main risk, which is what the West's interest in Armenia is. And that's simply use it as another Ukraine that is a tool against the Russians, whereas the Georgian prime minister argued in Georgia that the main interest in Georgia was to use the Georgians as a second front against Russia. So I think, Armenia might be putting itself in a very dangerous position.
Indeed, that's very interesting. We do remember that the charter signed by Washington and Tbilisi in 2009 read that deepening Georgia's integration into Euro-Atlantic institutions is a mutual priority, and two sides plan to undertake a program of enhanced security cooperation which intend to increase Georgian capabilities and to strengthen Georgia's candidacy for NATO membership. And now today, in 2025, Georgia is still not a member of NATO. So, Mr. Howard, what do you think about implications of such a close cooperation between Armenia and the European Union, Armenia and the United States of America for a peace process, negotiations between Yerevan and Baku, if there are any?
Well, I think the incoming Trump administration is going to be very energy oriented, and so its interests in the Caucasus will be much different than the Biden administration, which was trying to engage Iran. So the key thing about the Trump administration is that they will be trying to apply maximum pressure 2.0 against Iran. And so if you're looking at a map, the most logical partner for that would be Azerbaijan, because Azerbaijan is very much in the driving seat in the region, and especially in terms of its oil and gas and energy resources. So the Trump administration is going to be much more sympathetic to applying pressure on Iran, and certainly Armenia is a very good, maintains a close relationship with Iran. So that is not going to be very helpful to the United States, and I don't think that the Trump administration is looking to increase its military presence in Armenia or in the Caucasus. It's trying to get out of the Middle East, if anything, and has a much different strategic perspective that's vastly different. But the one thing that I would say is that Azerbaijan's position is much stronger in the region now because of the Russian setbacks in Syria, the Turkish cooperation that is going on with Russia over Syria, and the evacuation of Russian forces from Tartus. So the overall geopolitics of the region are very much in favor of Azerbaijan and Turkey at this point. And I don't think that the situation now, I would say that there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal yesterday by a member of the Turkish parliament who is of Armenian descent that is calling for a Turkish or calling for a deal on Karabakh involving the Trump administration getting involved. Now, there are rumors that Rick Grenell, the Trump envoy for North Korea, is interested in Azerbaijan and the Karabakh question and trying to get the U.S. involved. I don't necessarily think that Baku welcomes this because it's doing a good job of negotiations with Armenia right now, and they don't want outside parties. So, but we'll see. I don't know what's going to happen, but the point is that some people in the Trump circles are saying that maybe there's a role for Rick Grenell in the United States getting involved. So there's a lot happening in the Caucasus right now. Georgia is still having its time of troubles and instability. So it's very much, the region is very much unstable right now, and the United States needs a stable strategic partner in the region. And I still think that Azerbaijan can offer that.
George, what's your opinion? Could this agreement lead to shifts in regional alliances or power dynamics? If yes, then how exactly?
Well, we do not have crystal ball, and we do not know what will happen after January the 20th. I think it will significantly depend on the team around President Trump and the redistribution of responsibilities. So previous speaker mentioned about certain characters who might be involved. Well, it remains to be seen how it will play out. It seems that for Trump administration, which used to be more transactional in his first term, so these lofty talks about like democratic development will be less important. So it will be more about like power politics. So less reliant on this like liberal world order. In this regard, so Azerbaijan might come out on top in terms of priority and the reliable partners. But again, so I think 2-3 months into the administration, we will be more able to make any meaningful predictions in this regard.
Very interesting. So, Mr. Dizon, could this strategic partnership between Armenia and the West and with the United States of America especially be leveraged against Russia or Iran?
Well, possibly both. And again, this is why it's a very strange move by Armenia, because two of their best friends in the region has been Russia and Iran, and this pivot to the West by Pashinyan, it's effectively undermining a lot of these relations. And meanwhile, it appears to be strengthening Turkey and Azerbaijan, which are considered to be the main adversaries of Armenia. So in terms of the geopolitics here, it doesn't make that much sense necessarily. And again, I think if we look at the just economics of the whole thing, it's going to be very deeply problematic. Again, if the objective is to diversify, I would say this is it's a good move, but it appears to be a pivot, that is to move into the Western orbit, which does make sense geographically, geopolitically, economically. I think you see the Russians owning a lot of the own a lot of key assets in Armenia, from the railways or gas pipelines, mining companies, and it's security-wise, as I mentioned before, I don't see the Americans or the EU being able to project much force there. There was an interesting comment actually recently by the former advisor of Zelensky, Arestovich. He made the point that ironically the only two countries who would be willing to fight for Ukraine would be Russia and Belarus, which is now the one they are put up to fight. So it's I think it's the same might apply for Armenia. I think once it has used up its utility, it could be cast aside. But it's I think this whole geopolitical shift of the region, it's very unpredictable. So I very much agree with the former speaker. That is, it all depends which direction Trump takes this, and we'll probably find out within the first few months. But I'm expecting that this is it doesn't matter that much, I guess, given that this is the last week of Biden, and when Trump comes in, at least so far, I'm going with the assumption that they will prioritize Azerbaijan, and also, of course, trying to reset some relations with the Russians. So I don't think they are as eager, the Trump administration is eager to confront Russia with another proxy. Sorry, it's not necessarily a proxy, but to confront Russia in another area, much like the Europeans or the Biden administration has been.
Mr. Howard, quite interesting that next month the USA will have a customs and border patrol team travel to Armenia to work with their Armenian counterparts on, I'm quoting this, it was stated on the official website, to border security capacity building, strengthening security cooperation, enhancing Armenia's peacekeeping capabilities through exercises like Eagle Partner. There is already a mission in Armenia on the conditional border with Azerbaijan, and also Russian military base is still there. Isn't it too much for such a small country like Armenia? Mr. Howard?
Who is the question for?
To you.
To me.
Yeah.
You have to understand that there's a big controversy between the United States and Turkey over Syria and U.S. forces there. It's very controversial inside the United States, and the Trump administration has been eager to get out of there. So when you're asking a question about U.S. forces in Armenia and border security and things like that, I just would not put too much emphasis on that. It's an agreement. They have to work things out. I don't think American forces are going to be organizing patrols along the Zangezur corridor with Armenian forces. I just don't see that happening. But the United States will play a role to help them strengthen in some aspects. But whether there's going to be, quote unquote, boots on the ground in Armenia for the Americans, I really question that. And I don't think Azerbaijan should be too stressed out and worried about what the implications of that are.
George, would you like to add something? In my previous question about the intentions of the European Union and the United States of America to increase its presence, even when it comes to the militants in Armenia, while there are still some military bases of the Russian Federation?
Well, it will depend on the composition of the United States administration and how forceful, on what tier of priorities the South Caucasus region will be. Given its proximity to the Middle East, like to Iran, it might be pretty high, but again, it remains like to be determined. As far as European Union is concerned, well, the European Union still has failed to develop its geopolitical muscle. It's a wonderful economic organization. Again, its presence in Armenia is very gratefully taken by the Armenian citizens. Besides its very limited efficiency, that's something that Armenians consider part of their cultural code, but it doesn't translate into geopolitical clout, geopolitical heft. So therefore, I believe kind of this general agreement and these calculations of Mr. Pashinyan are either overly optimistic or they mostly calculated for the domestic audience, just to garner more votes and just to garner more domestic support.
George, but taking into account the knowledge we have about the Armenian policy, do you still think that Yerevan may be able to balance between the West and East, mostly between the West and the Russia?
Well, it also depends, however strange it might sound, on this goodwill of the West. Again, so I hope you and the interlocutor excuse me for being parochial and Georgia-centric, but I cannot help but see the elements of the double standards in this regard. Well, Georgia has been castigated for all the shortcomings, for all the deficiencies, major deficiencies of the Georgian leaderships lately in terms of democratic backsliding and other aspects. One of the main lines of attack of Georgia, mostly vocalized by Congressman Joe Wilson, a Republican representative, is that Georgia is becoming pro-Iranian, Iranian support. They show pictures of Georgian prime minister attending the funeral of Iranian president, and that is one of the reasons why Georgia has become enfant terrible or bête noire for the West. But we see that Nikol Pashinyan attending precisely the very same meeting, the very same funeral, the very same inauguration of the Iranian president. For some reason, it is not problematic. It wasn't problematic for the Biden administration. It might be the issue for the incoming Trump administration.
Mr. Dizon, the issue with Georgia, we do remember the political crisis faced by the country just, if I'm not mistaken, some weeks ago, a month ago. That was a reaction on the elections and, of course, about the policy taken by Tbilisi in regards to the Western powers and towards its independent intentions, as it was stated by officials. And its also intentions to join the European Union, the negotiation process. When it comes to Armenia...
Obviously, kind of these shortcomings and the massive blunders on the part of Georgian administration, they are palpable, they are clear, but here I'm just comparing these relations towards Iran, the Iranian, I would say, card, which is being used against Georgia, but somehow turned a blind eye on in case of Armenia.
Indeed, right, it's clear. And what's interesting for me now, Mr. Dizon, if you can comment on this issue, do you think that Armenia will be able to balance its policy in between of two parts? There is almost a Cold War between the United States of America and Russia, and taking into account still huge dependence of Armenia when it comes to economy and energy issues to Russia. If there is a possibility for Pashinyan's government to find a balance in between and keep the stability inside the country?
Well, I'm quite skeptical.
No, Mr.
I hope so, but...
Yeah, please, go on.
Yeah, but the whole point of a balance is that's not the purpose of Armenia here. It's not the point. Its role and its value to the NATO countries is to be used against the Russians. So the whole premise that it would be able to strike a balance, it would go against it. And again, I would just agree with the the case of Georgia, because if you see what Georgia's done over the past 20 years, it pretty much implemented a lot of the directives, or all of them it got. It did all the reforms. These days it's popular to present the Georgians as being anti-EU or anti-West, but they want to join still the European Union. It's the West that won't take yes for an answer. What made us, what caused the problems now with Georgia, which is why it's being demonized, is because they didn't want to be used as an instrument against the Russians. They didn't want to become another Ukraine, and this is the problem. So I think the same might apply to Armenia. So if they think they can strike a balance, I just don't think that's the role we have made for them. The whole purpose is to reduce Russia's role in the region, to even destabilize some of its borders. Of course, Armenia doesn't have the border, but nonetheless, I think this is the objective. So being able to balance, I think, is going to be very, very difficult. But as I said before, if Armenia is able to diversify ties without being used as an instrument, great. I just don't see Pashinyan being able to deliver on this. But again, perhaps I'm overly pessimistic.
That's, talking about the future prospects of cooperation between Armenia and the United States of America, I cannot avoid a question, Mr. Howard, and now I'm asking you. The negotiations held in between of two countries was also about nuclear cooperation agreement, commonly known as 123 agreement. As it was stated by Secretary Blinken, it will provide a framework for cooperation in the peaceful use of nuclear energy. So it made the Metsamor Armenian nuclear power plant still operating in Armenia. It turns out that Yerevan will have disagreements with Moscow on this issue as well.
Well, I would have to ask you and your listeners to think about, when was the last time you saw the United States working privately with a private company like Westinghouse operating in the former Soviet Union, setting up a nuclear power plant. So whatever cooperation agreement was signed between the United States and Armenia is purely on the efforts of technical assistance. I'm pretty sure, and you're not going to see an American company like Westinghouse going to Armenia to help them set up things. So I just don't see that as happening. I think it's a very, again, there's a lot of symbology in this agreement with Armenia. A lot of it won't amount to a lot. I can tell you that when the Trump administration starts working next week, I don't think cooperation with Armenia is going to be high on the agenda. They will be reviewing everything in their plans and strategy and what they want to do. And I don't think Marco Rubio is necessarily a big fan and supporter of Armenia. He may be, I don't know, but I just don't think this is going to be high on the list of the Trump administration priorities. And that whatever agreements are signed are purely symbolic. Yes, there will be some things that they'll be doing, and some groups from State Department will be visiting Armenia and setting up technical cooperation and inspection and discussing ways to help Armenia. Okay, well, there's a lot of more bigger, more important things going on, like the Zangezur corridor that are going on in the world. And I just don't think in energy and the gas transportation, I think that's going to be far higher on the agenda for the Trump administration than will be, say, just technical cooperation on nuclear cooperation with Armenia.
George, so just to sum up, what do we have to expect about the future interest of Washington and their foreign policy priorities using Armenia and Armenian support? Now I'm talking not only about Russia, Iran, the South Caucasus, but if two sides have this cooperation agreement, then it means that in global issues, the United States will also need or look for Armenian support in some other regions. What do you think on that?
Well, Armenia lacks that geopolitical military heft to support the United States, other than voting in the United Nations and some other fora.
So it's more about diaspora support.
To a certain extent, it is domestic issue for the United States as well. We know that there is Armenian constituency, particularly in Massachusetts and California, as well as in some other states. So it could be also the issue. It could be also related to the potential rapprochement with Turkey, maybe some backing towards the finalization of the agreement with Azerbaijan, which seems to be within reach for about like a year, but still actually kind of like cannot be achieved. So it's becoming more bilateral, maybe like some prodding on the part of the United States. Given that Russia, however strong in Armenia, is bogged down in Ukraine, is relatively weak, and therefore is less able to do some harm. Maybe there is a window of opportunity. So particularly kind of on the South Caucasus front. South Caucasus, let's say, real.
Mr. Dizin, my last question, just to sum up, does this agreement provide any security guarantees to Armenia from the United States, or, as we already discussed, this is the last attempt of Joseph Biden to show its intention to do global issues on the global arena, and we may expect some changes after some months of Trump's administration came to power?
No, I don't think there's any guarantees there. I think it is somewhat superficial, symbolic, and also I think a key purpose behind it is to give some credibility to Pashinyan, because a lot of the policies he's pushing now, they don't make much sense geopolitically. They're making Armenia very exposed economically, with the higher energy cost, cut of its main trading partner, which will happen if they try to exit the Eurasian Economic Union. None of this makes that much sense. And at the same time, I doubt how much focus Armenia will get, as the previous speaker said, now that we have, Syria, which will go into meltdown probably over the next few months. You're going to have heightened tension there, just between Turkey and Israel. There is too much happening. And in addition, we have this effort by desire at least by the Trump administration to reset some relations with the Russians. So I just don't see neither the intentions or the capabilities to do much in Armenia. So I think so far the Russians are to some extent ignoring it. They are essentially letting Armenia make the mistakes, but they're not going to go in and intervene somehow with a strong arm like they've done in Georgia 2008 or in Ukraine. It simply would be counterproductive. I think it's more beneficial for the Russians to let the Armenians make these mistakes and sit on the sideline, much as the Russian decided there wasn't much more they can do in Syria. And for the Americans and the Europeans, again, they would like to wrestle Armenia away from Russian orbit, but beyond that, there's not much purpose for them in that part of the world.
Symbolic meaning of this partnership cooperation agreement between the United States of America and Armenia. Well, dear experts, thank you. Thank you very much for joining our discussion today.
Thank you.
And thank you, dear viewers, for watching Inside Politics. I'm Anastasiya Lavrina. Do stay with us and see you in the next edition.